Hello, my name is Fanuel, and welcome to SAi TV. So the topic of funding is a concern for many decision makers within civic science, broadly speaking. And when we're talking about funding, really what we're talking about is sustainability. Because without funding, we can't sustain the work that we're doing, wherever that may be. And so at SAi TV, we have looked at this issue from multiple angles. And in fact, we are just getting started. And so we have asked surveys, we've shared some surveys on Twitter, for example. What do you struggle with the most? And we've seen that funding keeps coming up. We've also more recently, last year, we asked many of you, how are you thinking about the funding landscape in the upcoming year or so, given the uncertainty in the economy? And we're actually surprised to see that many of you are thinking that the funding will continue to stay the same, more or less. Of course, the jury is still out on that, and so we'll keep a pulse on that to see how it develops. We've also looked at this issue from the philanthropic point of view. So we had Eunice Mercado Lara, who is the Open and Equitable Civic Science Fellow for the Open Research Funders Group, ORFG, who came to talk to us about designing equitable funding programs for science and innovation. Let's have a listen to what she shared with us.
The logic of a funder is I am not the expert. I am funding the expert. So I think it's a very wise and humble position to say, you tell me, what do you think is the right output for your project? What's the right impact I should be tracking? Because maybe I want to see a paper, but maybe it's not a paper. Maybe it's a database in terms of outputs. In terms of outputs, maybe it's not only the database, but how many people actually went to that database and changed something. But it's super hard for me as a funder to understand. So that's the vacuum in which narrative statements could contribute.
Welcome back. And we also had the joy of having Lindsay Collin Wilson, who is the CEO of First Star. And she took us through her advice for any decision maker who's running an initiative in this space of science engagement and civic science. How do you navigate uncertainty? Have a listen to what she shared.
Area that I think is really important for nonprofits to understand is this notion of model creep. A lot of times, if we don't prepare for a recession and we find ourselves underwater, or that we may not have the cash flow necessary to get through the end of the year, we then write a grant that is outside of the model, outside of what we are used to doing, what we do well, what we've learned to do. And what that usually results in are more challenges for the organization than the than the benefit of bringing in the additional dollars. Because you may have to hire some new people, you may have to understand a new space or ecosystem within your environment that requires additional resources that may have a negative impact on your overall operating budget. Because while you may have accounted for certain expenses through the grant, you didn't account for others because you're expanding your program without having made those adjustments to your operating budget or to the operating budget itself.
Welcome back. In an effort to continue this discussion, we were joined once again by our special contributor, Shiva Asma, who runs our own science writing small business called Fancy, LLC. And so she joined us to talk about the business side of her work. Now, before we get to that conversation, let us do the numbers. Be right back. And here is Shiva Asma. Shiva, explain to us your business model. How do you generate revenue to make Fancy Comma work?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think it's a question that everyone's thinking about, science writers, science communicators. And the answer is that we're entirely supported by ourselves. We're self-supported. So I started Fancy Comma. I didn't do it to become rich, and that's still not my goal. And I think that as a writer, it's possible to definitely make a living off of science writing. And I think many scientists don't know that it's possible to do so. But to answer your question after this long tangent, we're supported, our funding comes from our clients. If you go to fancycomma.com, you can see who our clients are. They're major players in science, policy, technology, health, finance, business. A lot of people you've heard of. I think a lot of times scientists think they're selling their soul by working with these companies, but I personally find it very meaningful, because if scientists don't actually work with these companies, then there will not be any science communicated properly. So
in a way, like because on your site, for those who are going to go to your site, you offer several services, right? Web writing, medical writing, white paper writing services. I mean, all these types of services. And so I'm just curious, like, if you think about it over time, how's your business model evolved over time? What's your core bread and butter right now?
Butter of Fancy Comma is what's always been, which is explaining science to people that need it explained to them. So it's working with biotech companies. Maybe they need a tweet about something really esoteric in science that a scientist has to understand the nuances of and communicate. Or sometimes we've worked with Congress, or worked not with Congress, but adjacent to Congress, writing white papers for Congress to understand different reforms that could be possible. That there was like a huge issue that we've worked on, several issues that have made it to the forefront. One is the chips. We worked on a white paper for a small business talking about the importance of having a domestic semiconductor infrastructure. We've worked on numerous projects. I personally have worked unpaid doing political writing messaging for political candidates. But the bread and butter of Fancy Comma is communicating science. I had a client that is working on creating action figures about different characters in science, and they needed bios for the boxes because they're going to be sold at Barnes and Noble. So it's kind of, the bread and butter is always just writing about science, communicating science, talking to people about science. It's kind of what I've been doing my whole life, trying to get people to understand science. And that's actually very lucrative. And I don't think many people know that, but combining a science background with a marketing knowledge, which I've learned all my marketing expertise through working with different clients, is actually very powerful, very lucrative.
So when you look at your business model, how does it compare with what other science writers, those who are running LLCs, how does it compare with what they're doing?
Well, I've never actually compared my business model to theirs because I've never thought about it. I don't know what other people's business models are. I know there's many different types of businesses you can have, you can do science writing, you can train people in science communication, like scientists, to help them communicate science better. You can mentor other writers. As a journalist, you can mentor journalists. I don't know how my business model compares. I'm really happy with my business model, and I think that I've been able to do some really interesting and cool stuff over the past 10 years as a freelance science writer. That I used to start out writing articles about cheese for like $9. Now I get $250 an hour, which is a lot. And because I have the relevant skills and experience, and I'm not afraid to ask for that amount of money. And I'm gonna just ask for more because I need to make money and I have to pay the bills, and if I can't pay the bills, I can't do anything. So I would constantly get some clients, think about the skills I had learned, add that to my resume, and then rinse and repeat over several years. In the pandemic, I was doing so much different science writing that I just raised my rate from, I think, $75 to $250 by the end of it. The cardinal rule is to start small and only do what you can do right now, because maybe if you're trying to get into science writing and you decide you want to start a podcast and you go out and you buy microphone and like all this stuff, like you might not be able to pay that off because you never know. Freelancer income is really unstable, so you might not be able to pay it off. So I only did what I had the money to do. So like buying a website domain for like $20, because that's all I had. I used my $20 that I had to
Welcome back. And we look forward to having Shiva Asma join us on occasion from time to time to share her insights on various topics. And so with that, thank you for joining us this week. We'll see you next week. This is SAi TV.